Hello everyone, my name is Alison Humes and I'm the National Director for BASWA Cymru, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar, which I'll be chairing. And the webinar this evening is Transitioning into Frontline Practice. I'm sure you'll agree that we have an excellent panel with us this evening who will each introduce themselves in turn, and they'll be presenting on the following. So what you need to know in order to return to frontline practice, some personal reflections on actually making that transaction, and very importantly, how you keep yourself safe and maintain your personal well-being. There's going to be an opportunity to take some questions. The first opportunity will be following the first two presentations, and then again once the final presentation has been made. And you can also, I don't know if you can all see on the right hand side of your screen, there should be a chat box. You can also communicate with us during the webinar via the chat box. When we come to the end of the presentations, we'll just do some signposting to some what we hope will be really helpful resources to help you make that transition back. And I think all I need to do now is to hand across to our first presenter. Over to you.
Thanks, Alison. My name's Joey Nasowska and I'm the chair of the British Association of Social Workers, and I'm also an independent social worker. And I'm also now on the list for Social Work England, which is the area of the UK that I'm based in, to return to practice should I be needed in the southwest, because I live down in Devon. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the personal and professional preparation for returning to practice. So if we could just have that first slide, Steph. So I'm going to talk a bit about how social workers can prepare to go into practice during the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly some reflections about things to consider and some information to signpost you to. It's not going to be every single thing that's out there because there is an awful lot of information. So I'm just using my own experience and some of the conversations I've had with independent social workers to highlight the major things that might be useful to you. We could have the next slide, please. Thought it'd be useful to start with just some personal preparation around returning to practice. So this is kind of drawing again on my experience and experience of talking to independents, just to think through, actually, is this for you? Whether that's that you're new to practice because you just qualified, or you're looking to go into a first job, or you're coming out of a different kind of role, or in my case, it would be going back into practice after something like 10 years of doing support work for social workers. So these are some questions really that just might be helpful for you to think through. What's your personal situation? Is it actually reasonable for you to make that transition? Thinking about the responsibilities and pressures that you have, because although it's ethically wonderful to go back into practice, it's not going to be possible for everyone, and there's lots of other ways that you can support communities and families and the people around you, and also, you know, we do need people to do some of the thinking behind the scenes and the supporting behind the scenes. Also thinking about what can you offer, so what sorts of roles, experience, expertise have you got, and thinking more widely than just the social work roles. And then really importantly thinking about what you'd need from an employer. And when Neil talks about well-being, that's one of the things to be really mindful of. Actually, what would you require to support you if you went back into a practice role? So we could go into the next slide. So thinking about the professional preparation as well, and these are questions that I've been asking myself, homing in really on your social work background. What experience have you got? Where have you worked before? What sorts of things have you done? Which kinds of groups have you worked with? How does that translate into working through a more crisis situation and the particular needs that we're seeing emerging in the pandemic? So where could you be helpful? And then particularly the capabilities that you have, because one of the things that's really wonderful about social workers is that there's a core set of things that we are supported to learn about as we're training, that we would always encounter in practice. So there's a lot to build on, even if you've not been in practice recently. And then what additional professional development would you need? And again, that's an individual question for what you might want to go and learn about, but it's also something for thinking about what you want to ask your employer about in terms of, say, an induction, particular kind of resources and things that you would need when you get into practice. So as I said, there is a lot of information out there. So I want to take us through the kind of main places to look, and I'm going to particularly focus in on all the stuff that BASWA has pulled together, because that's one place that you can go to and it makes it a bit more manageable. So I can have the next slide. So these are the areas that all of us are having to get to grips with, and actually anyone who's in practice anyway is having to kind of learn some new things and get some new information. For each area, I'll give you some suggestions for what you can look at. I think it's probably worth saying at this point that each of the regulators in the 4 nations is also doing work around particular support for people going back into practice. So in my case, Social Work England have arranged through the Local Government Association to run things like webinars and put out training information. So I don't think there's any problem in a bit of duplication, because these things are messages that we need to kind of develop and be reinforced. But I'm going to be focusing, as I said, mostly on the BASWA stuff and the things that the association has put out. And that's around public health and health and safety, law, policy and regulation, ethics and practice guidance. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the starting point, I think, for considering any sort of role or undertaking during the pandemic is to be sustainable and look after yourself. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to help others. So that really starts with the foundation of following the public health guidance the best way we can. So what you'll see there, that first link, is the BASWA page where we've gathered together the most relevant public health information. And that's also, you'll see below that the gov.uk website. That's where all the new guidance comes out, and it's coming out more or less on a daily basis. It's really important to say that so far, and this might change, there hasn't been specific public health guidance directed at social workers. So there is public health guidance that covers a range of settings and places and roles that are similar, and BASWA's tried to distill that into our practice guidance, which I'll come on to in a minute. But there is a little bit of a gap there, and of course it's something you'd need to take up with an employer as well. So the last link on here, the Social Workers Union Health and Safety at Work position statement, that's a really good place to go looking in terms of what you can expect from your employer. So Social Workers Union have written a statement drawing on advice from the General Federation of Trade Unions, which they're a member of, and BASWA has endorsed that, and it sets out some of the things around health and safety at work or working from home, and really kind of gives a good platform for you to think about what you'd expect in terms of your own health and safety. Have the next slide, please. So law and policy and regulation. If I went through some of the changes that are happening in the law and policy, that would take up the whole time of the webinar. So I'm not going to do that, particularly because there are 4 different nations involved here. So there's slightly different things happening in different nations. The Coronavirus Act that was enacted a couple of weeks ago, that covers quite a lot of different matters. BASWA has done some really good summaries of that. There's new things happening all the time, so keeping up to date with that can be quite an endeavour. So I would absolutely advocate going to the BASWA page for your country. So there's BASWA Cymru on there, BASWA England, BASWA Northern Ireland and the Scottish Association of Social Work. And all of those are easily findable if you just go to baswa.co.uk. Those pages also cover links into the regulator's latest information. So that's really helpful for you thinking about how you would register, what the expectations are around fitness to practice and that kind of thing. Can I have the next slide? And then the kind of most important thing, I suppose, for us to anchor ourselves in if we're going into practice or whatever role we have is the ethics. The code of ethics that BASWA holds for social work in the United Kingdom is absolutely relevant during a pandemic. It's a really good place to go back to really just kind of ground ourselves in what we're trying to do as social workers, what our purpose is. And that covers the purposes of upholding human rights, promoting social justice and maintaining professional integrity. And then there's also ethical guidance that BASWA has produced about doing social work during a pandemic. and that's a mixture of looking at what your role as a member of society is, but also looking at what your role in practice would be. And the practice role is kind of mirroring the things for you to think about your ethical approach with the sort of support and help that we should be giving each other as social workers. So when Alison talks about signposting and support later on in the webinar, that's actually an ethical action that we're doing. So that's a really good place to kind of just go back to anchor yourself about what you're trying to do. And then if I could have the next slide. This is probably the big one. This is the practice guidance that BASWA has put out. So there's quite a lot of different elements of professional practice guidance that have been done so far and that are on their way. And of course, whatever role you go into, you would expect to have induction and support and policy and processes from your employer. So this practice guidance is what social workers, as social workers, might need to consider in different areas. And it's UK wide, so it applies to any social worker in any setting, in any of the countries. And so far there's been home visit guidance, hospital visit guidance, some information about guidance for children and families work, guidance around end of life, safeguarding adults, and multidisciplinary work. And there will be more coming, so that page is a really good one to kind of go to and take a look at. The other thing that's worth highlighting, which you can also really easily find from the BASWA website, are the digital capabilities for social work. They came out actually just before, they were finalised just before the pandemic, and so they are really, really relevant. They help you think through the ethical and practical implications of using technology and doing work virtually. So that's quite a good place to go to ground yourself as well. If I could have the next slide. So this is just to put up as big and as clear as I can, the central page for finding out all this stuff. If you go to baswa.co.uk, the first thing you'll see at the top of the page is coronavirus updates. And this is the link for it. From there, you can easily get to the guidance that we've collated, the practice guidance that we've produced, the ethical guidance, and the guidance for the 4 countries. So that would be the way to immediately hone back in on things. And I suppose that the last thing that I'd want to say is pace yourself, because there is quite a lot of information coming out, but what we have to remember is that all social workers have this grounding in ethics and capabilities that will hold good even in difficult situations. So I'm going to hand back to Alison for the next speaker.
I think we might have temporarily lost Alison. She's disappeared off my screen, so I'll pitch in anyway. I'm John Dudley, and I'm currently BASWA's honorary treasurer, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. But what I'm really going to do is I'm going to tell you something of my story to how I got to this point of considering returning to direct practice, having been, I guess, 40 years a social worker in various different places and settings and roles. So I hope you're sitting comfortably, and I'll just tell you a little bit about how I came out of practice and how I am hoping to return. And I thought through, I guess, some of the questions and some of the issues that Jerry has touched on in those lists that she gave us earlier. So, as I say, I've been a social worker for a number of years in all sorts of different settings, in local authorities, in the voluntary sector, as a frontline social worker, as a team manager, and most recently, and also as a service manager, and most recently as a team manager with Worcestershire's adoption service. And I stepped back from that role about 3 years ago, largely because both my parents were elderly and ill at the time, and they needed extra input, and I was at a position where I could actually offer some of that, and I was really glad that I took that opportunity, and I was able to provide some more support and care to them at a time that they needed it. So that's how I came out of direct practice at that point. I maintained part of my interest in social work through my involvement with BASWA, and as one of the honorary officers, effectively I'm working effectively for 1 day a week for BASWA, in a role of treasurer and as part of the honorary officer group within the association. So that's kept me in touch with practice. It's enabled me to keep my professional development and indeed my registration up to date, even when I've not been in direct practice for a little while. Sadly, my mum passed away in December, just a week before the COVID outbreak in Wuhan was announced to the world. And in a way, I'm thankful she hasn't had to put up with that. She had very good care in a nursing home, and many of those locations, situations are in great difficulty at the moment. But that gave me an opportunity, once my immediate family issues had been dealt with, to consider whether at that point I should return to some sort of direct social work practice. So I was beginning to think about it. And then, as we know, along came COVID-19. And many of us rushed to help in different ways. I signed up as a Red Cross Community Reserve volunteer. But the very next day, the government set up the NHS volunteers scheme and with the Royal Voluntary Service. And that, of course, has absorbed many thousands, tens of thousands of people into that organisation, which appears to have struggled to cope somewhat with the demands that's placed on its infrastructure. But then I started to think about whether I could make a contribution in a different way, and I guess the question came, as it might have to some others as well, would be when my grandchildren ask, "What did you do during the pandemic?" And what would my answer be to that question? And I guess some of us will be considering that. And as someone actively involved as an honorary officer of BASWA, we are able to provide key member impact in input into the excellent staff of BASWA, and we can help respond to the crisis in that way. So I guess I'm making some sort of contribution, certainly part-time. But is that enough? Could I do more? That was the question I was asking myself. And would my skills be, could I be using my skills on the front line? So at the beginning of April, as we know, we were in lockdown, and Social Work England announced Social Work Together, and like Jerry, I signed up and I wait to be linked with a local authority through that process, which is being progressed through in part through the Local Government Association. But then, of course, last week, an overlapping initiative, Care for Others, Make a Difference, to attract thousands of social care workers or workers into social care. And that was set up by Skills for Care and the Association of Directors of Adult Services, and included, again, another opportunity for people to consider a paid career in adult social work. So there's a little bit of overlapping things going on there. But as Jerry has pointed out, part of what I've had to consider, as anybody else, is it safe for me? And is it safe for others? Now, fortunately, I'm not in a vulnerable group myself, but I am getting just a little bit near to a group that perhaps is a little bit more vulnerable by virtue of age. So I've had to give that some thought, but generally I'm in good health, so I'm happy, and I'm not having to give care directly to anybody who's in that vulnerable group, and certainly anybody who was in that situation would perhaps be not advised to progress into work within the community, which is what I'm interested perhaps in doing. And then, of course, for a couple of weeks, all quiet. So I started to look around at what local authorities were actually doing, having not heard anything back directly from the Social Work England approach. And local authorities appear to be taking very different approaches. Some looking on their websites are suggesting that you can return to practice with them, but they will expect a full-scale application form and all the sort of rigmarole attached to that. And it's not clear what length of commitment that you're making if you begin the road down that particular process. Whereas another local authority, a neighbouring local authority to me, simply had an approach where you fill in a very short form and they will get back to you and talk through the options. So a very different approach, and I haven't had a call yet from them, so I'm still waiting to hear what that sounds like. But then I did actually get an offer, but it was from a local authority who wanted to have a full CV from me. Well, usually if you're applying to local authorities quite often, they say, no, we don't use CVs. So they wanted something that I wasn't entirely expecting. But the more practical issue, which amongst the practical issues which we all have to think through, is that it was also at least an hour's commute away if I was to be doing community-based social work with that particular local authority. So as Jerry has said, we have to be clear about what we feel we can offer, not just in terms of our skills, but also in terms of maybe the length of time commitment that we want to make. I'm not looking to return to a permanent role, but I'd be happy to give a temporary period of time to help out in the current difficulties. Likewise, we have to think about whether we can offer full-time or part-time employment, and also look at things like practical issues like traveling distance, and especially in these difficult times where we're being encouraged not to travel more than absolutely essential. And then, as Jerry said, what is the local authority offering? What are they offering by way of induction? What are they offering by way of supervision, support, mentoring, training, equipment, laptop, phone, personal protective equipment, pay and conditions? The guidance on the various websites says basically all of that is up to the local authority to decide. So it could be that if you're approached by several different local authorities, you will end up with a range of different offers and quite a diversity within that. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. And then there's the practicalities of looking after yourself. Clearly, if like me, you've been mainly working from home for several weeks now, and you're thinking about venturing back out into the community, then that does put you personally at some additional risk. With the absence of testing for most of us, and we'll be fairly well down the line for that, it's something that we all need to consider. So we need to consider the practicalities of even things like what are we going to wear, how we deal with our outdoor clothes when we come back into our own homes, but which we perhaps share with others, the fact that we'll need to ensure extra hygiene precautions, washing your clothes at 60 degrees maybe rather than the 30 degrees we're used to. All important stuff if we're facing a virus that we still can't see, we still can't trace, and we still can't track, and for which there's no cure. So it's also something that I've had to think about for me, and I guess we all have to give some consideration to in terms of what would happen if I got sick, because that is actually a possibility. And of course, there's been precious little public information about how we deal with that as an issue if we're at home. When I've looked into it for myself, I've decided what things would help in terms of if I was to get sick, and I've made some precautions to put myself in the best place possible if that unfortunate thing was to occur. But it's a risk. We need to be prepared for it. And certainly in terms of advice and information, I have found personally that the only real advice and information you get is from first-hand accounts of people who've actually suffered from the virus, and that gives you more information and insight into how we might deal with it if we were to get ill. So it is crucially important to look after ourselves. I guess what we also have to remember is whatever is on offer, there's actually no obligation to say yes. That you can pick and choose, and it would be right and proper to make sure that there's a good fit between what you're offering and what the local authority is looking for. And I get finally from me, don't forget your lifelines in all of this. And I'm not perhaps thinking about sort of ask the audience or even 50-50, but maybe phone a friend. If there are offers that are made to you that maybe you're not sure about, ask people, phone people up, ask people, discuss it with people you can know and trust, and say, well, what does that sound like to you? Am I doing the right thing? Use those lifelines, and hopefully we'll all be able to make the best contribution we can, and importantly, get through it securely and safely. And with that, back to Alison.
Thank you, John. I'd just like to apologise to everybody for my technology malfunction. Technology is wonderful when it works, and mostly, thankfully, it does. So I think we've had a question in specifically on what the situation is for returning social workers to practice in Wales, and I think I'm probably best placed to answer this one. So the questioner has asked, what is the situation for social workers who left the register and hope to return? And this is specific to Wales. So Social Care Wales, our regulator, has opened up a temporary register. The register is going to remain open. The temporary register is going to remain open for as long as the crisis continues. There's no fee to register, and there's a particular part of the social care website on temporary registration that you need to go to in order to make an inquiry to register your intent. And essentially, the register is going to be open for social workers who've left within the last 3 years, and they will be forwarded onto the temporary register as long as things like they've not been barred from practice during that time, as long as they don't have any pending investigations in other parts of the UK. And there's still the commitment to abide to the codes of practice. The second part of the question is asking about student social workers, and again, this is specific to Wales. At the moment, student social workers in Wales are not being fast-tracked into practice. They're mostly being redeployed into social care type roles, although under the new legislation there is the potential to fast track student social workers if that becomes necessary. So I think I'll hand over to our final presenter to introduce himself and to deliver the final presentation.
Okay, thank you, Alison. I'm Neil Thompson, and I'm an independent writer, educator and advisor. I'm also an ambassador for Baswa Cymru and for the Social Workers Union. I'm here to talk to you about self-care and resilience. So next slide, please. Yeah, so self-care, why is it important? Well, self-care has been a theme of my work for as long as I can remember. Many years ago, I was asked to be involved in a research group around stress. And by being involved in that, it made me realize just how harmful working in the caring professions in general and social work in particular can be if we are not taking self-care seriously. So what we need to do is to think very carefully about what self-care means. Next slide, please. So the main reason why self-care is important is we can't care safely for others if we're not caring for ourselves. And note the emphasis on the word safely, because it's perfectly possible to care for others without caring for ourselves, but then we're putting ourselves at risk. And in effect, we're not only putting ourselves at risk, but others as well. If we don't look after our own health, our own well-being, then we can not only make ourselves ill, we can also be dangerous in our practice. If we're too tired, we're not able to concentrate, we are not being as creative as we should be, we're not learning from our practice because we're just under too much pressure and we're struggling to cope with it. We're not doing what's required in terms of self-care, then that's a very problematic situation to be in. So the emphasis here is on practicing safely for our own sake and for the sake of others. Next slide, please. So how do we do self-care? What's involved in it? Well, there are various elements to this, and I haven't got time to go into great detail about this, but just to give you an overview of some of the key issues. Next slide, please. What I want to focus on are what I like to call the 3 S's of self-care. The first one is support. being prepared to ask for support and not see doing so as a weakness. I mentioned a moment ago that I'd been involved in doing research around stress, and one of the things that emerged from that is that there is a strong tendency to see people who are stressed as weak and inadequate, as if it's something wrong with them, rather than something wrong in the situation that they are in. Everybody has a breaking point. Everybody has a point where the pressure is just too much, and we should be able to recognize that and support people. But because there's this tendency for being stressed to be stigmatized, then what can happen is a vicious circle develops, in the sense that people who are in need of support will often not ask for it because they think that to ask for support is a sign of weakness. It's a way of saying that you're not coping, you're not capable, and so on. And really, we need to challenge that idea, because that's basically an example of what's known as blaming the victim. The way I see stress is that it's like pain in the body. When you experience pain in your body, it's telling you there is something wrong. There is something that needs attention. And stress is similar to that. That stress is telling us there is something wrong, there is something that needs attention, but it's not necessarily something wrong in that individual. It's something wrong in the wider circumstances that we need to look at. So we need to look at it holistically. So a key part of self-care then is being prepared to ask for support and not falling into this trap of seeing it as a weakness to say, I need support. Because let's face it, we all need support at times, especially in the difficult circumstances we face as social workers. Next slide, please. The second S is solidarity, which basically means recognizing that we're in this together. The more we pull together, the easier it is for everyone. Sadly, one of the common effects of stress is that it pushes people apart. People can go into their own little bubble, as it were. It's like a sort of a defense mechanism that people can cut themselves off from others. So instead of having, say, a team of 8 people working together and supporting each other, you end up with 8 individuals all within their own stress bubble. And that is clearly not a healthy situation to be in. So a key aspect of self-care is solidarity. Look out for your colleagues and let them look out for you as well. Anything you can do to support teamwork and team development can be really useful in terms of self-care. So that's part of this idea of thinking holistically about it. Next slide, please. And then the third S is self-awareness. We need to be able to tune in to our own needs and not block them out. Now, one of the characteristics of the caring professions in general and of social workers in particular is what psychologists call being other-directed. What that means is that there is a common tendency for members of the caring professions to focus on other people's needs. By definition, we tend to be caring people. We tend to be sensitive to other people's needs and problems and want to do something about that. But one of the prices we can pay for that, one of the things that can cost us dearly, is we can then neglect our own needs, so that we're focusing so much on what we can do to help and support and empower other people that we're not attending to our own needs. So people can have problems around not eating properly and not getting enough exercise, not sleeping properly, and so on, not allowing enough time to recharge our batteries, in a sense, because we're focusing too much on helping others. And that's where the danger sets in, because what we can end up doing then is stretching ourselves too thinly. So we need to have that self-awareness about our own needs, be prepared to make sure we're looking after ourselves so that we're well equipped to look after other people, rather than make this common mistake of focusing more or less exclusively on other people's needs and then neglecting our own. we're not much help to people if we're too tired, we're not able to concentrate, we're making mistakes. We're not, as I said a moment ago, we're not being creative in what we're doing. We just tend to stick to standardized ways of working. People expect and deserve better from us, and we should be thinking about that for ourselves as well. We deserve better for ourselves too than to be in that situation. So self-care has to be an important feature. Next slide, please. So that's the three, go back one, please. So that's the three S's: support, solidarity, and self-awareness. And we need all three of those. It's not a case of, well, I'll stick to this one, that's my favorite, or 2 out of 3 is not bad. If we want to be serious about self-care and surviving in the difficult circumstances we face, then we need all three of these elements. Next slide, please. Now, as well as the 3 S's, we've also got 3 A's to consider. Next slide, please. And the first of these 3 A's is acceptance, and that's acceptance that we can't do everything. The technical term for this is humility. It means recognizing our limitations. We can't meet everybody's needs. We can't get it right every time. We can't solve all the problems. There is a limit to what we can do realistically. And if we don't accept that, then we're back to this danger of overstretching ourselves, of trying to do more than we reasonably can, and therefore putting ourselves at risk. And as I've already said, when we put ourselves at risk, we put other people at risk as well, people who may be relying on us. So this first A, this acceptance, is about being realistic in terms of what we can achieve and facing up to the fact that we can't have a 100% success rate. That's not realistic. We don't expect, for example, the police to have a 100% success rate in clearing up whole crimes. We don't think that they failed if they are not able to convict somebody for every crime. And we must not allow ourselves to be put in a position where we are expected to have a 100% success rate in everything we do. That's just setting ourselves up to fail and setting ourselves up for stress and all the harm that can come with it. So this humility, this acceptance that we can't do everything, is a key part of self-care. Next slide, please. And the second of the 3 A's is assertiveness, which basically means learning how to say no. That we will often be put in a position where demand is greater than supply, and we have to be able to draw a line in terms of what can be done and what can't be done. If we approach our work with the attitude that we have to do everything that is asked of us, if we're not prepared to negotiate about what are the priorities, what are the things that we can realistically fit in, but the things that we can't realistically fit in, if we don't go through that process of negotiation, that process of being assertive and learning how to say no, then we're putting ourselves in a dangerous position again. And this isn't about digging our heels in and being difficult or causing problems for people. That's a common misunderstanding of what assertive means. Assertive means finding win-win outcomes or creating win-win outcomes. And that's a process of negotiation. As social workers, we should be very good at that. Our interpersonal skills should put us in a very strong position in terms of being able to negotiate what is a realistic workload. Now, one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this is that there is a myth that if people are given more and more work, they will achieve more and more results. But the reality is that if you are given a workload that is higher than a reasonable, manageable workload, you actually end up achieving less because you become stressed, you don't concentrate as well, you make more mistakes, you don't learn, you're not as creative, you perhaps spend more time off sick, you spend more time just trying to recover from what's happening to you. So the idea that our workload can be unlimited is a dangerous myth. And we've got to be able to draw a line and say, this is where it stops. And I know from bitter experience that a lot of people find that really, really difficult, because they're caring, because they want to be supportive. Then what they do is they try to say yes to everything. And that is not only unrealistic, it's positively dangerous. Next slide, please. And then the third A is allowing, and specifically allowing a balance between work and personal life. There's been a lot of talk over the years about work-life balance, and that's not a term I like, because it implies that somehow work and life are separate things. And of course, work is a key part of life. But there are two separate domains in a sense, the world of work and our personal life. And we have to get a balance between the two. So if we are putting all our energy into our work and not leaving enough for our personal life, then again, we don't have the opportunity to recharge our batteries. There's an important physiological thing here about recovery, because you see, if you stretch yourself physically or mentally up to a certain point, you'll then have time to recover from that exertion, then you won't injure yourself. But if you don't allow enough time to recover from that, you risk strain, and in other words, stress. Think about this in physical terms. If you are physically exercising and you get to the maximum you can cope with, and then you allow yourself enough time to recover, then that's a healthy way of doing it. But if you push yourself to the limit and then before you've recovered, you are doing more strenuous exercise, you risk straining a muscle or worse. The same applies in terms of our emotional and mental energies as well, that we need to have time to recover before we pick up the threads again. It's something I've talked about a lot on training courses I've run on these and similar topics, is that if you go home after a day's work and you're tired and worn out, but you feel positive about it, you feel that although it's been a hard day's work, it's been a reasonable amount of work to do in that day, then by the time you start work again the following morning, you will, in most cases at least, have recovered from the exertion. But if you are exerting yourself too much, then you won't have time to recover before you're back at work the next morning. And so you then risk the equivalent of pulling a muscle in terms of your mental and emotional energy. And that's, of course, where burnout becomes an issue. We need to have time to recover before we take on further exertion. So next slide, please. So those are the three A's then: acceptance, assertiveness, and allowing that balance. So what I want to emphasize here again is we need all three of these. It's again not a case of, well, I'm pretty good at this one, so I won't bother with that one. These are all essential elements to have to the fore. So next slide, please. Now, I just want to say a few words about resilience. This is something that has become quite an issue in recent years. It's not a new idea. It's been around for a long, long time, but it's sort of had a rebirth in the last few years, that more and more has been written about it. It's been used more and more as a concept, as an issue in the world of work. Next slide, please. Okay, now I just want to make three particular points about this. First of all, it's important to recognise that resilience is not a personal characteristic. It's actually a complex psychosocial phenomenon. Now, what I mean by that is that it's very easy, and a very easy mistake, I should say, to see resilience as something you've either got or you haven't. You know, as if there are two types of people in this world, resilient people and non-resilient people. And that's a gross oversimplification to see it in those terms. What goes to make up resilience is partly psychological individual factors, but also significantly wider social factors as well. The support levels people have, for example, the culture that they are part of, the communities maybe that they are part of. So to understand resilience properly, we need to look at it in this much more holistic way. And that's what the book that you can see the cover of there is all about. I co-edited this with my friend and colleague Gary Cox, because we both come from a sociological background, and we were very, very concerned that what was happening was more and more resilience was being seen in this very narrow, individualistic and judgmental way. And that then leads to my second point, is that resilience is not a stick to beat people with. It's sadly, I've come across quite a few people who've told me that they've been given unreasonable workloads, and when they've said this is too much work for me, they've been criticized for not being resilient enough. Now, to just make sure that we're crystal clear about this, what resilience means is the ability to bounce back from adversity. It's often referred to as bounce back ability. So it's basically when life knocks us down, we're able to get back up again. And so it's very significant for social work in a number of ways. But this idea that an absence of resilience is something, a label that you can perhaps stick on people, is very dangerous territory to get into. We have to make sure that people are not falling into that trap and appreciate the more holistic understanding of resilience. Which brings me to the third point, which is the social context. The social context can nurture or undermine resilience. So the social context is crucial. And this applies to the people that we serve, the people that we are supporting, caring for and empowering, that we should not be in a situation where we're undermining their resilience, we're actually nurturing it. But it applies to ourselves as well, to look at what circumstances, and again, it's back to getting that support we need, what circumstances will support our resilience. So trying to move away from this oversimplified notion that resilience is something you've either got or you haven't. It's very complex, but it's very much a part of self-care, because there will be things that will knock us down and we will need to get back up again. But we shouldn't see that as a failure. We should see that as part of life and something that we can learn from. Next slide, please. So that's it in terms of what I wanted to put across, just very briefly, that self-care is essential. It's not a luxury. It's not something I'd like if I can fit it in. We need to have that self-care, and resilience, to be understood in this broader, more holistic sense, is a key part of it. So I hope that's been helpful, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So I'll hand you back to Alison. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, for that presentation. And I think there's lots in there for all of us to reflect on what are certainly really extraordinary times for the profession. We have a question which I would like Jerry to take very quickly, if you can, on it's a question about AMPs and returning to practice, whether or not they need to meet the 18 hours training requirement.
Yes, so this is approved mental health professionals, which is the mental health social worker role in England and and it might be relevant to other nations, so we're going to focus on England. If you've been an AMP but not practiced recently, the question is, can you get your warrant back? And the answer is yes, but there is a requirement that you meet 18 hours training. So you can look out for online training that's being offered to returning approved mental health professionals, and then you'll be able to meet the requirement of the 18 hours and be able to get your warrant.
Thank you, Jerry. I'd just like to direct everyone to the handout section of the page, which is on the right hand side, and there you'll find two resources. There's the PowerPoint from this evening and also a PDF with a list of really useful resources. There'll be links to all of the BASWA COVID pages that Jerry's already spoken about, to public health across the 4 nations, and also to the 4 regulators and their specific COVID-19 pages. If you have any other queries or concerns, please let us know about them via the BASWA survey, which is ongoing and will run throughout the course of the pandemic. And independents can also join the Facebook group or join also the LinkedIn and other forums. So I think I'd just like to thank the panel for their excellent presentations and all of that really important information. But I'd especially like to thank everyone that joined the webinar this evening. I'd like to wish you all luck in your transition journey. And I'd just like to say thank you from all of us for making the decision to transition back into frontline practice. Thank you.